Hello Year 7, I hope you are doing well. So in today's history class we're going to be doing how did William control England using the feudal system. Your learning outcomes are to define and understand the ideas of hierarchy, explain the key details of the Norman feudal system, and to describe the key roles of the king, the nobles, the knights, and the peasants in the feudal system. So if you'd just like to pop the video on pause so you can write down that title and the learning outcomes, and then we can start our lesson. Right, so the first thing I want us to do, I want us to try and think about who has the most power in school. So there are 6 different groups here. I have the deputy head, the caretaker, the teacher, the students, the head teacher, and the head of faculty. I want you to rank these from the ones that have the most power to the least power in a school. So if you can pop this video on pause, I'll give you time to do that. Okay, so let's see who has the most power in the school. So hopefully we all said the head teacher has the most power. They're at the very top of this hierarchy. Then we should have the deputy head, the head of faculty, the teachers, the caretakers, and unfortunately for you guys, students will have the least power in a school. So this is just a nice clear example of a hierarchy that we still have in today's society. So we're going to look at a different hierarchy that really helped William take control of England. Okay, so we are going to look at the feudal system. So this is where the English people would receive land and protection in return for some sort of work, military service, or taxes. So the feudal system was a type of hierarchy, and by hierarchy we mean that there was a group of people ordered by their importance in society. So just like the school, where the head teacher is the most important and new students are the least important, the feudal system has these similar tiers as well. Okay, so here I hope you can see the feudal system hierarchy. So at the very top, you should see the king. So the king owned all of the land in the country and he made the laws. He gave an area of land called a fief to rich lords and nobles. So he was at the top of the feudal system. Below him, you have your lords and nobles. So in return, the lords and nobles agreed to supply the king with soldiers and horses for his army. The nobles gave some land to professional soldiers. So the professional soldiers would be third in this hierarchy. So in return, these knights, so that's another word we can use for professional soldiers, they were knights. They fought for nobles and the king. And finally, on the bottom, we had peasants. They worked the land for the nobles and knights who in turn offered them protection. So everyone has some benefit here in the feudal system. The king is obviously at the very top making those laws. The peasants at the bottom, they don't get any land, but at least they are protected. So for our second task, what I want you to do is draw this table on your paper, and I'm just going to let you pop the video on pause so you can do that, and then we'll go through what I want you to do. Okay, great. So now you should have drawn your table. We're going to go through some positives and negatives in this feudal system for each person. So I think we can do the first one together. So we're going to look at the king. And this is perhaps the hardest one to think of negatives for, but hopefully we all know that the positive should be that the king owned all of the land and made the laws. This puts the king in a very strong position. So what can the negative be for the king in the feudal system? Well, the king had to be a strong leader, otherwise this system would collapse. If the king wasn't really doing a good job, the people below him can stop giving him money and they can stop doing the services that they need for the king to remain in charge. This was a real problem and it was up to the king to make this feudal system work. So now I want you to have a go at thinking of a positive and negative that the nobles, knights, and peasants would also face. You can use that little table at the side, or you can think of some of your own reasons. So once again, if you can pop the video on pause and we can run through the answers when you've done that. Okay, great. So now we can run through these answers. So you might have some different answers, and that's perfectly fine, but let's just see what I've written down. So for nobles, I think the main positive thing is that they would receive an area of land called a fief from the king. They would get some land. A negative point, the nobles had to supply the king with soldiers and horses for his army. So the nobles had a responsibility to the king. They had to make sure he had an army, and they were the ones supplying those soldiers and horses. If they didn't do this, they would lose their fief. For the knights, a good positive is that the nobles gave some land to these professional soldiers. So this is really important, and really it shows how the feudal system works. Those nobles had land, they would then give smaller bits of land to the knights in exchange for the service. So a negative of being a knight is that they had to fight for the nobles and the king. So like I said before, they weren't given this land for no reason. They were then expected to go and fight for the nobles and the king. And the peasants, of course, there aren't many positives in the feudal system for being a peasant, but we can say that they were offered protection. If you were working on a noble's land, you would be given protection by that noble. And the negative, they didn't receive any land in the feudal system. So of course, this is really the biggest issue for the peasants, whereas the king, the nobles and the knights would get some sort of land. Peasants didn't really own anything. They were just constantly working so they could be protected. Okay, so now we're going to move on to look at why William needed the feudal system. So this system was brought in by William, and we're going to look at why. So although William had won the Battle of Hastings, he still had to conquer the rest of England. Once he had conquered all of England, he could use the feudal system to keep control without having to be everywhere at once. So before, when the Anglo-Saxons were in control of England, this was a real issue for the king. He never had complete control over the whole of England. He would constantly be having to put people down. So when William became king, he had people he trusted, those nobles, taking charge of small areas of land that he still technically owned. This way, the only people that had land were entrusted by William. It kept William at the top of the hierarchy, while those underneath him would be less likely to revolt because they earned privileges. And finally, William also came from Normandy in France. In Europe, the feudal system had already been around for about 200 years, so this was also a tradition that William was bringing to England. The feudal system was William's way of forcing England to change and be more European. William wanted this control, but he was also European, and he thought that this new feudal system would really benefit England. So our next task, we're going to look at each person's role in the feudal system, and in particular, what they were meant to be doing. Okay, so in our task 3, we are going to match some sentences to see what each group had to do in the feudal system. So I'm going to read out all of these parts of the sentences, and then it's going to be your job to write on your piece of paper the correct matches. So the first one, the peasants were. Second one, if the knights did not do their jobs for the nobles. And then the third one, in their own fiefs the nobles were. And then last, of course, is just the king. And now these are the ones that you're going to be matching with. So in control and responsible for collecting taxes. Second one, responsible for making sure the country had enough food. Third one, they would have to give up their land. And then the fourth one, they owned all of the land and handed it out in exchange for protection, loyalty, and service. So just before you get started, we can do one together. So I think we should look at this first one. The peasants were, and I think it's the best answer here, is responsible for making sure the country had enough food. This was the peasants' main responsibility in the feudal system. They would be farming on the nobles' fiefs. That's really important, and it's a really important job. So even though they were at the bottom of the hierarchy, they still had a role to play. Okay, so now if you can pop the video on pause and try and figure out the rest of those 3 answers, and then we will go through them together. Okay, so hopefully by now you've managed to write down the sentences and match them correctly. We can go through them together. So if the knights did not do their jobs for the nobles, so the answer to that one is they would have to give up their land. So remember, the knights are below the nobles in the feudal system. The nobles were giving them land. They could just as easily take it away if the knights refused to join the nobles or the king's army. In their own fiefs, the nobles were in control and responsible for collecting taxes. So even though the king was giving this land to the nobles, they were still responsible for doing a lot of the work. They had to collect the taxes, they had to make sure that the rules were being followed, and they had to make sure that both the peasants and the knights were following those rules directly. And then finally, the king owned all of the land and handed it out in exchange for protection, loyalty, and service. So again, we talk about that protection. He's giving that to the peasants. He's making sure, that the nobles are loyal to him, and the service he's going to get from the knights when they have to join his army. Okay, so now we can move on to our final activity. Okay, yes, so our last activity, we're going to try and write a P paragraph answering these two questions. Just had to pause there because the bell was ringing in the school. Which group do you think had the hardest job in the feudal system? So you're going to write down your answer using one piece of evidence with an explanation. So remember those P paragraphs. That's your point, evidence, explain. So you can pick any one of these four groups. There's the king, the nobles, knights, or peasants. I've even done a nice little sentence starter here for you, so you could easily start this like, I think the peasants had the hardest job because. And then when you've done that one, what I want you to do is write another P paragraph, which is which group do you think had the easiest job? And again, your sentence starter that you can use, I think the nobles had the easiest job because. The most important thing here, year 7, is remembering to use that P structure that we did for the essay on William of Normandy. Okay, year 7, so I'm going to give you time to do that. This is going to be the end of your lesson. I hope you're all doing well once again, and I can't wait to see you back in school. Thank you for joining me today. I will see you next time.